For a character that is so friendly and often boldly bright, at least when it comes to his color scheme, Spider-Man sure has a solid number of dark supervillains lurking around. Welcome back, Nerd Squad. We have already discussed some of the darkest villains in Spider-Man's rogues gallery, but we're back with even more. Really, there are just so many Spider-Man villains who are willing to take their evil plots to new extremes, and so many with dark origin stories that have likely driven them to become as bad and twisted as they are today. We'll be exploring some of them and just what makes them so dark as we count down the top 10 dark Spider-Man supervillains Part 2. Yep, Part 2! So if you haven't already checked out the Part 1 to this list, click on over here to do so. And be sure to stick around to the end of this list as well, where I will have some bonus content coming your way in the form of comment responses. Alright, now let's get counting. Number 10. Sandman. Sandman has always had a kind of tragic story. He was a criminal who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and due to radioactive exposure was granted his sand shape-shifting abilities. He hasn't always been a villain, and sometimes strives to become a sort of hero, though he usually ends up becoming a criminal once more in the end, tragically. He even has been known to be a sometimes friend of the Fantastic Four's Ben Grimm, aka The Thing, and Spider-Man. One dark story involving Sandman took place during one of the many times he fought Spider-Man. Spider-Man usually had creative and sometimes twisted methods when it came to how he chose to defeat Sandman. He vacuumed Sandman up at one point, tossed him into a wind turbine, and he's even set him on fire. But Spider-Man also at one point exposed Sandman to an experimental chemical substance, which caused Sandman to become insane and also caused him to become severely dirty, as dust and garbage and debris became attracted to him and entangled within him. The worst part of this was when Sandman pleaded with Spider-Man to fix him, as his mental state continued to worsen and deteriorate. And initially, Spider-Man was actually a jerk and refused to help. Pretty messed up. Number 9. Vermin. Vermin was a Spider-Man villain who really only became such because of previously being abused by others throughout his life. Edward Whalen as a young boy was severely mistreated by his father and ended up running away because of this. He then ran into Baron Zemo and Arnim Zola and became the victim of their experiments, which transformed him into a rat-like humanoid creature. They sent Vermin on a mission to eliminate their enemy, Captain America. This conflict eventually led him to be apprehended later on by both Captain America and Spider-Man, who ran into Vermin in New York City. Vermin would also become the prey of Kraven during his last hunt, and from there would end up becoming allies with Spider-Man actually. Number 8. Hammerhead. Hammerhead has a pretty dark origin story in comparison to some other villains. He and his family had left the Soviet Union when he was young, and he grew up claiming to be Italian instead of Russian, even preferring to speak Italian in his family's home. However, this would anger his father and would prompt him to beat his son with a hammer, scarring up the young boy's head. That's pretty messed up. In the end, Hammerhead managed to work his way into the Italian mob and would also end up beating Spider-Man in a fight. He was given both cybernetic enhancements, including a partial adamantium skeleton, and had his strength level increased by Mr. Negative. He also has been known to work with Black Cat when she is walking on the more villainous criminal and organized crime side of things. Hammerhead would also get revenge on his father, killing him with a large hammer. His origin could have possibly served to inspire the Daredevil Netflix series Origins for Wilson Fisk, who also killed his father with the hammer. Number 7. MINDWORM. MINDWORM might not have been a major Spider-Man villain, but that doesn't mean that his story wasn't super dark and tragic. MINDWORM was William Turner, a mutant with powerful psionic powers who was kinda like a mental energy vampire, not to be confused with Will Turner from Pirates of the Caribbean. William needed to feed on others' mental energy or he'd actually die. As a child, he accidentally killed his mother in front of his father, draining her mental energy completely. His father went into shock and died as a result of witnessing this. William would then be raised in an orphanage, studying passionately and known for his intelligence. As an adult, he fed off of his neighbor's mental energy, taking a little from each person in his area, but not enough to kill anyone. Unfortunately, Spider-Man was one of his neighbors and sensed what MINDWORM was doing. Misunderstanding that William's psychic attack was for evil purposes, Spider-Man fought MINDWORM and handed him over to the police. Later on, the two enemies would actually become friends. However, MINDWORM would also later on once again relapse, becoming a criminal, as well as becoming severely mentally ill, in addition to being homeless. This all culminated into prompting MINDWORM to give up when he was being attacked by a street gang and allow himself to be killed. So sad. Poor MINDWORM. Number 6. Hobgoblin. There has been more than one Hobgoblin over the years, but many of them have proven to be quite dark villains. Roderick Kingsley as the Hobgoblin would be the one responsible for the creation or transformation of Peter Parker's friend and Betty Grant's husband, Ned Leeds, into another version of that villain. Ned Leeds was brainwashed by the Hobgoblin and convinced to commit criminal acts, even sometimes believing that he himself was actually Roderick Kingsley, the Hobgoblin, causing him to behave extremely villainously, adopting the Hobgoblin persona for himself. When Ned Leeds was murdered, it was because Kingsley had leaked the true identity of Hobgoblin as being Leeds, causing him to be targeted and killed by the Foreigner. Number 5. MORLUN. Even when MORLUN is not threatening the entire existence of all of the spider totems in massive stories like Spider-Verse or Spider-Geddon, he's still pretty terrifying. Despite looking like a gothic vampire wannabe, MORLUN is actually one of the Inheritors, a family of energy vampires who feed off of totems throughout the multiverse. In the story The Other, he also tormented Peter mercilessly, almost killing him at one point, beating him to death, and eating one of his eyeballs. Ew. Number 4. Kingpin. Despite the fact that Kingpin isn't one of the first people you think of when you think of dark and menacing Spider-Man villains, he's been around since the early days of Spider-Man's adventures, appearing in Spider-Man comics in the 1960s alongside many of Spider-Man's other classic villains. Wilson Fisk has always been one of the darkest, most menacing villains because of the amount of power and control that he wields. In the film Into the Spider-Verse, we saw respect paid to this character in terms of how great of a Spider-Man villain he truly is when he became the big bad of the film that Miles and his team of Spider-Folks went up against. He was also the one responsible for killing the Peter Parker from Miles' own reality. And in the comics, he also almost killed Spider-Man's Aunt May, after learning of Spider-Man's secret identity and choosing to target those Peter loved during the events of the Back in Black story. Number 3. Lizard. Lizard is one of the darkest villains on Spider-Man's roster because of how tragic his origins are. Kirk Connors basically is a victim in a monster horror story, a sort of werewolf-like scenario, but as a lizard instead of a wolf. Dr. Connors simply sought to explore the science behind possible limb regeneration, and it was his studies and exposure to an experimental serum that caused him to transform into the villain known as the Lizard. He is often presented as a villain who has no choice but to give in to his animal instincts, which is what makes him so villainous, while Connors himself really has no intention to harm others. The monster within him, however, the Lizard, often does. At one point, he transforms back into the villain known as the Lizard during a story called Shed, and is tragically consumed by his animal instincts completely, which causes him to eat his own son. It doesn't get much darker than that. Number 2. Scorpion. Originally, Matt Gargan was just a private investigator hired by Jameson to uncover the secret of how exactly Peter Parker was able to get the best pictures of Spider-Man. He was later coerced into participating in an experiment wherein he was combined with the traits of a scorpion. This gave Gargan superpowers but also drove him insane, transforming him into a criminal and a villain. During Dark Reign, Matt Gargan would become Norman Osborn's Spider-Man on his Dark Avengers team, bonding with the Venom symbiote, and becoming one of the most vicious iterations of Venom to date when bonded with it. In fact, anytime Scorpion and the Venom symbiote have merged in the comics, they become a deadly villain, often going on a murderous rampage, shamelessly consuming their victims, and becoming an almost uncontrollable level of deadly. If you thought Eddie Brock's Venom was scary, no. Scorpion as Venom is scary. Number 1. JACKAL. JACKAL, of course, is one of the darkest Spider-Man supervillains around. He was Gwen Stacy's teacher, Professor Warren, but became obsessed with Gwen and fell in love with her. When Gwen died during the battle between Green Goblin and Spider-Man, the professor blamed Spider-Man and decided he would create a clone of her and Peter Parker, after learning of Spider-Man's true identity. He was the villain behind the events of Clone Saga, creating more than one clone of Peter and of Gwen Stacy. And if you thought the Scorpion was scary, JACKAL was also a villain who teamed up with Scorpion and even sent him to kill Spider-Man at one point. He also kidnapped and threatened the life of people Parker cared for, such as his good friend Ned Leeds. Thank you so much for watching, Nerd Squad. Who are some of your favorite Spider-Man villains? Which do you think is the darkest? Which villains would you like to see develop into something even darker? Let us know in the comments below. And speaking of comments, it's time to turn to some comments from one of our latest videos, Top 10 Dark Spider-Man Villains, which is the part 1 to this list. Carlos Ortiz comments, Spider-Man has some of the best villains in my opinion. Spider-Man will always be my favorite hero. I can respect that. In fact, I think Spider-Man and Batman are the two heroes that I think have the craziest rogues gallery, and I mean that in the best way. Lewis the Slytherin writes, Tombstone is an underrated villain. My favorite version of him is in The Spectacular Spider-Man. He's great. Yeah, I could see that. I feel like Tombstone doesn't get as much love as he probably should, and I feel like we forget about him, but he was such an awesome villain in the 80s. I wish we could bring him back today. NG480 ponders, White Rabbit is sorta like a mix of Harley Quinn and the Mad Hatter, which she would really get along with considering the Alice in Wonderland persona. Wow, yeah, that's really true. I've actually never thought of that before, but she is kind of like a weird combo of those characters. I feel like she'd get along with both the Mad Hatter and maybe Harley Quinn. I would love to see a Harley Quinn White Rabbit team up. Crossover, crossover. And that's all the time we have for comments today. Be sure to comment below for a chance to have your thoughts and feels shouted out in a future list. This has been Top 10 Nerd, and I'm your host Amanda McKnight, reminding you to stay nerdy, YouTube.